Today, though, we're talking, is somebody recording? Beth, are you?
Not yet, but I will be as soon as we're ready.
Okay, are we ready to begin, right? Yes, no?
Ready.
I'm going to start recording now, so Sandy, you can do the intro, okay?
Yeah, yes.
Hi,
I will.
Jared. How are you? Okay,
Good to see everybody.
Who is that? That said
Ready.
something.
that's
Oh,
Joanne.
Joanne and
Yeah.
Tim.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you start, Beth, okay?
Go ahead and do the intro. We're recording.
All right. So we're here tonight with Jared Carter, professor from the Vermont Law School, who will talk to us tonight about the Electoral College, a very important institution in our history, but also in our present, since the president of the United States, the president-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, has not been confirmed yet because that election that was held a month ago or so now can only be confirmed or denied by the Electoral College. And so Jared is here to talk about the Electoral College, how it works into our elections and into our lives, and talking about the historical, why it was constructed the way it was, and also how it was going to work out in the present election. So we're going to have Jared, and remember, Jared, leave a lot of time for questions because it's a very confusing topic. Okay, so Jared, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be back. Good to see lots of familiar faces as always. So as Sandy said, I'm going to talk a bit about the Electoral College. And I think there was a VICII talk on the Electoral College a while ago.
It was.
So I'm sort of breaking this up into thirds. The first third is focused on what the Electoral College process is, because I think there's a lot of confusion around that.
Right.
I don't know that there's anybody that knows exactly how it works, because there haven't been opportunities for courts to get involved in many instances. So I'll talk about sort of how it procedurally works in summary, and we can get into some of the details maybe if there's questions or we want to go there, and I can do my best to answer them. Then I want to talk about, so what is it? Where did it come from? I think there's some sort of popular myths about where the Electoral College comes from and why we have it. So I want to talk a little bit about that and my views on where it actually comes from. And this is why the title was the original sin. So you might start to guess as to where I think it comes from, why we have it, or why we initially created it. And then I do want to just chat a little bit about, okay, so where do we go from here? Sort of what are the options moving forward, if we like or don't like the Electoral College? And I'll try to be fairly brief, and then we can sort of chat and talk about it both from a contemporary perspective and historically, or sort of prospectively as well. So the Electoral College itself comes from essentially from the Constitution, and a process by which the executive is elected, as we know. There are, I believe, 538 total possible electoral votes. And as we know, sort of popularly speaking, we vote on election day. Those votes are tabulated at the state level. And then what happens from there, and this is sort of the process we're in now, at least for another week or so, is that those vote counts at the state level, our personal votes, are tabulated and certified in many states at the county level. So that's why you see sort of debates over, Dane County or Detroit, specific counties, because each county and its election officials will certify at the county level, and then that goes to the state. And the state has to essentially go through and once again certify that those votes were accurate. And that has to happen. The exact language is on the, and this is sort of bizarre, but it's the first, and excuse me, that's for the actual vote itself. But the electors meet at the state capitol on the first Monday after the second Wednesday. And that's why I had to read it, because it's hard to remember. The electors in all the states have to meet in their respective state capitals on the first Monday after the second Wednesday of December. So if you do the math, I believe that means December 13th, give or take a day or two. My dates might not be exact. The electors across the entire country will meet in their state capitals and essentially vote their electoral votes, right? One of those 270 that you need to become president, or the total of 538. So here's where it sort of gets complicated in many respects. In 48 of 50 states, the electors are allocated in full, right? Whoever wins a plurality of the popular vote gets all of the electoral votes, right? That happens on December 13th. Maine and Nebraska are the only two states that split their electoral votes. So that's why you saw, I think in Maine, which I believe has 4 electoral votes, 3 for Biden is what they project, 1 for Trump. I'm not sure where Nebraska fell, whether that was split or not. I don't think it was. But 48 of 50 states and the District of Columbia award all of their votes to the plurality. Then what happens is that, consistent with state law in each of the 50 states, those votes are sent to Congress. And so I think there's some questions out there as to whether or not the electors have to vote with the popular majority in each state. So in other words, in Pennsylvania, do all of the electors, if Biden is certified to have won the popular vote, do they all have to go with the popular vote? And in 38 states, the answer is yes. In 38 states, the electors, by state law,
Yes.
have to vote consistent. I believe it's 38, vote consistent with the popular vote. So that means in 12 states, they do not. In some of those 38, there's actually a penalty in which what they call a faithless elector, in other words, an elector who was legally required to vote a certain way but doesn't, and it does happen from time to time, there were some in 2016, can be penalized in some way. And in fact, just last year, the US Supreme Court upheld the state's ability to penalize folks in some way, financially or otherwise, for not complying with a state requirement that they vote in a particular way based on the popular vote. And so in most states, that's the way that it has to work. But either way, the legislature, or in some states, the governor, certifies the electoral count to Congress. We still don't have a president even at that point. We still don't have an actual elected president consistent with the process. Congress receives all of those, and then after, I believe it's January 6th is when it happens,
Yeah.
but after the next Congress is seated, which is on January 3rd, the new Congress meets the House and votes essentially to elect the president based on those electoral votes, to certify those electoral votes. Is there somebody that's not muted?
Randy, I think.
Randy. Anyway, I just could hear some people
Man
talking
is
on a
not
phone or
muted.
something. So anyway, so the Congress meets to certify, essentially elect the president based on those electoral votes, and it's a majority wins. So if the
Can I
majority,
interrupt you for a minute? So, so for instance, the votes from Vermont would go to Peter Welch. In other words, he would get to vote our electoral votes.
no, Vermont will send the tabulation of our elector. I'm not sure who our electors are in Vermont.
Oh, you never know.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm not sure who they are.
Right.
So that's a fair question. But whoever they are, they will vote. And Vermont is one of the 38 states, I believe, that requires the electors to vote by state law consistent with the majority or the plurality winner in the popular vote. But in any event, when that gets to Congress, then Congress votes, and it's a simple majority in order to win. If there is no majority, and this is set forth in law and in federal law, not in the Constitution. So if there is no majority, then Congress essentially calls a special election, and the members of Congress vote to elect the president. and that is done by state. So each state gets one vote. It's not by, the House is allocated, right now the House is controlled overall by the Democrats, but in fact, more states have Republican Congress people than Democrats. And so what could in theory happen is those Congress people would vote their state as directed by their state house. And you could end up in a situation where Congress could go the opposite direction if it so desired from even what the Electoral College selected.
Wow.
The Senate is responsible for voting the vice president. Obviously, none of this has ever happened. There's a couple instances in history where elections were disputed in some manner, the most recent being obviously the hanging chads of 2000.
Right.
And the Supreme Court decided in that case to stop the recount
Right.
counting. And if you recall, Al Gore then said, I'm not going to push this any farther. He could have, in theory, continued to try to get the state legislatures to do, essentially his bidding and say, switch the electors, or he could have petitioned the Congress people to vote differently. But if you recall, he said, I'm not going to push it any further. From
So
his
he
perspective.
conceded, in other words.
Right, he conceded. Yeah, he stopped.
Right, but that was like a month later too, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was maybe 21 days or 30 days. I forget the
I
exact
thought
number
30,
it
I
is.
actually thought 37, but I'm not.
37, that
Yeah, I
sounds right.
thought, yeah.
Yeah. So that's how it could play out. And during the discussion over actually essentially certifying the electoral votes in Congress, any congressperson can sort of stand up and object. So it could be normally it's sort of a rubber stamp process, as we know, but there are multiple mechanisms and opportunities for Congress people to get up and object. And I read an article today where an Alabama congressperson, I forget his name, has promised to do that on behalf of Donald Trump, no matter what. Whether he actually does it or not, remains to be seen. And that person can't ultimately change the outcome per se, but they can certainly make it. It's essentially the equivalent of a filibuster, but not with the exact same teeth. So I do think that we're going to probably continue to see sort of a bumpy process, to say the least, and that's why that in connection with the underpinnings of why we have this process, that's why I think it's a terrible process to continue going through for our country, not just because of all of the legal machinations that any candidate could conceivably try to use to change the outcome, but also I think the basic principles of one person, one vote. And when you look at the historical rationale, which I think is not the one that most people consider, it becomes even more troubling. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of how the process works. We can certainly go back and visit that again. Now, where did it come from? Why do we have it?
Jared, I wanted to interrupt a bit. Does anybody have any questions about that? Any questions? Okay, so in other words, what you're also arguing, it's not over either.
No, absolutely not. I mean,
So
I think,
right.
I have my personal views. I think in the end, politically, that we're not going to see, Trump is going to lose the election, and he's going to, and Joe Biden's going to get inaugurated on January 20th, consistent with the Constitution. But I do think that President Trump will continue to try these different levers that are out there that exist as a result of the Electoral College. I have personally serious questions as to whether he legitimately believes these are going to be successful, or if it's more about creating an atmosphere where he can raise another $170 million to use for his PAC. Yeah, I mean, I get solicitations every day still, multiple solicitations from him.
Okay, Sally has a question, but I think Jared was just going to go into that anyway. But Joanne did, which is why was it established in the first place? I think that's the second part. Right, I think that Jared will talk about that in a minute. But somebody else had a question, Joanne?
No, no,
No?
I was just saying that I think he's only trying to get enough money.
Right.
Either, I mean, that's why it's continuing.
Right.
I
Well, they've
don't,
raised
I don't,
$170
I think
million.
he's gonna try every legal shenanigan, every legal. I'm not gonna call it a shenanigan because it is the process. He has a right to do it. People who's kind of getting him to concede are crazy. He's not gonna concede. He's gonna do every legal angle and he has the right to do it. But anyway, so Sally had the question, Jared, go ahead.
I think
Why was
Robin
it-
has one too, maybe.
Robin.
Yeah, I was just wondering, does anyone know who our three electors are and why
Oh,
it's kept so obscure? Why don't we know?
I think
Because
Howard
they
Dean,
don't
Peter
want
Welch,
you
and
to
Madeline
know.
Keenan.
But
Simple, they don't want you to know.
Can't we,
Generally, it's.
isn't it publicly
No.
announced somewhere?
Nope.
I'm sure we could find it out. I mean, if somebody wants to Google it while we're chatting,
Google it.
I'd be curious to
I
know.
did at one point, and this is what I learned.
Yeah.
I learned that they are appointed by the legislative
Right.
body. And
Right.
that usually is quite partisan. For instance,
Right.
because.
Well, yeah, there's three Republican electors and three
Oh,
Democrats.
no,
And then whichever way the state goes,
Right.
those three are the ones.
And they would cast their
Yeah.
votes. That's normally how it
Right.
works.
right, yeah, that is, yeah.
But the Supreme Court has said, actually, they said in sort of superfluous language, but they said it nonetheless in the Bush v. Gore case. They intimated that states could actually change midstream. So in other words, if Vermont wanted to change its rules right now and say, actually, the electors have to vote for the loser, even after the fact, the U.S. Supreme Court intimated that they could probably do that, or they could potentially do that. Let's put it that way. Maybe probably is too strong. In other words, the legislatures, the states retain
Right.
ultimate authority for determining how their electors are assigned and how those electors should vote. And that's part of this history that I'll talk about in a moment. But it is the reality. Yeah.
Can I interrupt for one moment?
Yeah, of course.
I think the Constitution or the Supreme Court has established that the state's legislature are in charge of the process for
Yeah.
choosing, but not that they can switch at the last minute. There was some case I read about, I don't know how long ago,
Yep.
in which it becomes a legal issue and a governor could then
Mhm.
veto what the legislature does.
Yeah.
Because it's a legislative act. It's not extraneous from the normal process of passing laws.
Yeah.
So a governor could veto a change in the slate of the electors. That's why.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, none of this has ever happened, and so I think we don't. I think you're right in the sense that we don't know what the outcome of that would be. But there were serious concerns that could happen. That the legislature would send its slate, the governor would send its slate, and then Congress still has that ultimate authority to decide which slate do we take.
Correct.
But yes, and I think there's another question that's sort of tangential or somewhat connected to what you're getting at, Tim. But if the legislature, let's say the legislature decided that we're no longer going to follow a process whereby electors are required to vote with the popular vote in the state, if they were going to change that rule, would that require the governor's signature the way a normal law does? And if so, then could the governor veto it? And we'd be even in more limbo.
What about the 17 states that have signed on to committing their electors to the popular vote? There are 17 states.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
However many
196 electoral votes in total that have
Yeah.
signed on to that.
I mean,
Um,
that passed, right?
Well,
Yes.
so you got to get to 200. So so I was going to talk about that at the end. We talk about the
okay,
future,
okay.
but
Yeah.
I mean, it's perfectly fine to chat now. So it's the National Popular Vote Compact.
Yeah.
And it essentially, as you said, says that since states retain the authority to decide how their electors are ultimately required to vote, states could pass a law at the state level to say our electors must vote consistent with the national popular vote, not with our state vote, but with the national popular vote. And what that would do is once the equivalent of 270 electoral votes, states had joined that equaled the number of 270 or more, that would essentially mean that the popular vote would always win, and you'd never end up in a situation where the popular vote lost, but the Electoral College went for the other person.
That's kind of an end run around the Constitution about constitutional amendment.
Absolutely. And I think
Absolutely.
there's definitely questions. I mean, again, hasn't been tested. There's both the Constitution, and there's also something called the well, it actually comes from the Constitution, but the state compact law that Congress passed that says when states enter into compacts, normally they have to get congressional sort of blessing to enter into a compact that's enforceable. Now, again, there's sort of a question here because the Constitution explicitly provides that the states retain the authority over their electoral process. And so there's a big question, I think, whether that that compact law actually applies, because the Constitution says the states are the ones that get to decide this. And the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore and elsewhere has affirmed that.
Yeah.
So I think there's certainly, I mean, if I had to read the tea leaves, I would say that the National Popular Vote Compact would be constitutional and legal if it were to be adopted by the 270 by the 270 electors or more. But it's an open question that I'm sure would end up at the U.S. Supreme Court if and when another couple of states sign on to it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we go into Sally's question about why this,
Yeah.
and why we called this title of this talk also, the original sin,
Yeah.
institutional racism. Okay, right?
Yeah. So I mean, look, there's competing views over this, over the origins of the Electoral College, and there's certainly evidence that folks can pull to support different views. I think the one that we're sort of popularly taught about the Electoral College and why it exists, at least what I was taught sort of in grade school and high school, and maybe even in college civics classes. Do they still teach civics in high school and grade school? I don't know. But the idea was that the Electoral College would prevent big populist states from sort of dominating the election of the president, because votes would be distributed and the candidates would have to have geographically diverse constituencies in order to get to the 270 electoral votes. That was sort of the idea that was sort of popularly taught. And I suppose there is some validity to that. On the other hand, if that was the goal, where do the presidential candidates go now, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe they spend some time in Ohio still, Florida. I mean, the swing states are still the states where they focus. So it hasn't really in any, material respect changed the fact that most of the energy is focused on a small number of states. But if you look at the congressional, the convention and some of the Federalist Papers that the founders wrote under fake names, of course, but that they wrote, I think what becomes clear is that the Electoral College actually comes from our original sin, and that's slavery, and the power play dynamics between the North and the South at the time. Here's why. So I'm sure probably many of you have heard of the 3/5 clause that was in the original Constitution until we fought a civil war and got the 14th, 15th Amendment, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And that 3/5 clause was essentially this compromise that says we are going to count, they didn't say slaves, but I think they said other people, or all those other people not accounted for, as 3/5 a person. The South wanted that because obviously when you're allocating congressional seats based on population, the South wants to get more seats, but they don't want to let, at the time, African slaves vote. So they came up with this compromise that says, for the purposes of counting congressional seats, enslaved Africans will be 3/5 of a person. And that had the impact of increasing the number of congressional seats that the South got. And that was this compromise to allow the Constitution to move forward, because you needed to get Southern states to sign on. And without that, they weren't going to do it. And so that was this great compromise, this 3/5 clause. On its face, it has absolutely nothing to do with the Electoral College.
Oh, right.
Except that it essentially becomes part of the Electoral College like this. And Madison acknowledged this. If you look back at Federalist 68, the Federalist Paper number 68, and the Constitutional Convention, the same dispute arose with respect to how do we elect the president. Okay. And at the time, and this is what Madison points out at the Constitutional Convention, at the time, voting laws were much more diffuse and liberal in the North. In other words, there were a lot more voters in the North, not just because of enslaved Africans who obviously couldn't vote at the time, but the voting laws in the North were much more liberal, and so many more people could vote. And so the South was very concerned that if we have a popular vote, the North will be able to elect their president every single time. And that's going to threaten our peculiar institution of slavery. And so Madison points this out, and the compromise became, in many respects, the Electoral College, because what that did is the same way that the 3/5 clause allocated how many seats one state gets in Congress, it also allocated how many electoral votes a state got, right? Because obviously the South didn't want to allow Black people to vote in a presidential election, but they wanted them to count for the purposes of their Electoral College votes. And so they followed that same 3/5 model in allocating Electoral College votes in the South and the North. And that was what allowed them to move forward with the parts of the Constitution that dealt with the executive and how the executive would be elected. It was a compromise to appease Southern slaveholders. And Madison and others talk about this explicitly in those terms. And I think, yeah.
It seems to me, though, that within that Constitutional Convention, there were two positions put forward to establish the population of the United States at the time in the census. The North argued only count free people, correct? Only count in the census free people.
Yeah, I'm not sure about
Free
the census.
people. That was for the census. It wasn't for who gets to vote. It was for the census, okay? So the North said count every person who was free, which might have even included some free Blacks. Because there were free Blacks in the North.
In the North.
And the South argued count every person, correct?
I'm not sure about for the census purpose. I'm not sure.
Well, because the census determines the population, which determines the number of people in Congress.
Right.
Correct?
Correct.
No, and I'll say why it does not include Native Americans. But anyway, so there was an argument. The 3/5 compromise came out of that because the South said, if you don't go our way, we're going to secede.
Right. Or not join. We're not going to join.
We won't join because the Constitution was a compact. So they said, if you don't go our way, we're out of here. The North said, we can't have that because then we'll be taken over again by England. We had to keep the South. And so that was the 3/5 rule. But the South still got to control Congress in the 3/5 rule because it still gave them more population, which gave them still more control over the Electoral College. And Grant asked an interesting question. Would they have counted Native Americans? No, because Native Americans were not in the jurisdiction of the United States. The Native Americans always argued that they had their separate nations.
Well, and in fact, I'll get the exact language, but the Constitution until the 14th Amendment explicitly excluded Native Americans not taxed, I believe was the language it used. I could get you the exact language, but it excluded them from that. But
they didn't want to be included anyway, because they thought of themselves, as did the United States at the time, as having their separate nations. They were not included in the nation that was being born of the United States.
Yeah, and they're still, I mean, the reservations are still quasi-sovereign. In some respects.
Yeah, but they're not. I mean, they are citizens of the United States now.
Yeah, and the 14th Amendment, that was all part of that as well. And they got rid of all of that language in the initial Constitution through the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clauses. But so yeah, absolutely, Sandy, that's exactly right. So the 3/5 clause not only set the census and thereby set the number that each state would
population.
have in Congress, how many
Right.
reps at the initial phase, and thereby set the number of electoral votes
Electors.
that each state
Right.
would have. So
Right.
it really runs through all of these
Oh, wait a
things.
minute. Ask Sally, does that
Yeah.
clear that up, Sally? Sally? We can't hear you. I can't hear you. Anyway. Okay, go ahead, Jared.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you.
are there other questions about that? There's a brilliant book on this whole subject and it's rather short. It's called The Negro President by the historian Gary Wills. And he explains how slavery worked itself into the initial Constitution and into the Electoral College in a really short, really brilliant way. And it was really, they called the Negro president, the Federalists called Thomas Jefferson was the first Negro president because he was elected in the Electoral College based on the 3/5 rule. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because they also said things like he had fathered so many slaves that he was really the president that had created so much population in the South by himself, that
Yep.
that's how he won.
Yeah. Well, and it had an immediate effect because in I think it was the election of 1800.
Yeah.
If only free people had been counted, John Adams would have defeated
won.
Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
But obviously he didn't, and it was as a result of the additional votes that the South got through that 3/5 provision
Okay,
because it
in
had more
1800, I have
people.
another question, Jared. In 1800, I don't believe there was even a popular vote at all. I mean, when was there anything other than the Electoral College? When did it was instituted a popular vote at all?
Well, the Electoral College is from the founding.
I know,
So
but I'm not certain it was ever based on the vote of the general population at all.
yeah.
When did we
I'm
get
not
a general election?
Yeah, a good question. I'm not sure when we I mean, initially there was concerns too with respect to why they wanted to adopt the Electoral College, because we have this vast country. How are we going to be able to communicate the results across all of this space? And so if we have electors, it'll avoid that problem. But I do think from the founding, I believe that every state had a pot. You got to vote for the president, even if that
don't know.
wasn't. Yeah,
I
I'm
just
pretty
don't
sure.
know. I'd like to know that. And but there's another reason for the Electoral College, and it was
Mhm.
because the founders, there are a lot of reasons, but the other reason I believe was that they didn't trust the mob. The founding
Definitely.
fathers never trusted democracy in the first place, or never trusted one man, one vote. So that was the third, I
Yep.
think, reason. But the main reason I think was about slavery.
Because women
Yeah.
didn't vote.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. But I think, so yeah, there's definitely language that gets to your point. I think I was just looking at an article that ostensibly quotes George Mason,
Yeah.
and his quote is, "It would be unnatural to refer the choice of the proper candidate for the chief magistrate to the people, as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." So certainly there was the idea that you can't trust the people to
Mob.
vote
Yeah.
And
in a certain way,
That's right.
and certainly I think that as I see people nodding and smiling, and I mean I think there's only been a few instances where there's been a split, but obviously we've had quite, and I don't know if this is a representation of the division in our country, but it always strikes me as odd that we've had two of those instances in the past 15, 16 years. In other words, the popular vote going one way and the Electoral College going the other way. When I think there was only one other instance,
Wait a minute.
Sandy,
Yeah,
were there
go
more
ahead.
than one where in our history where that's happened otherwise?
Most important one though was 1876.
Yeah,
Do you know about that? Was the election between Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat.
right.
And at that time, of course, 1876 was the end of Reconstruction. And this is why this is the most, again, tied to race and racism,
Yep.
because there was a tie vote pretty much in Florida. And
Mhm.
so there was a special commission selected to decide who had won. And there was a deal made between, and Rutherford B. Hayes won that vote and the compromise. And in a way, good, because he was a Republican, and of course the Republicans were the anti-slave party. But the deal was that if he was given the vote, then he would withdraw Union troops out of the South and let the South go its own way. Its own way became Jim Crow.
Essentially ending Reconstruction.
And ended Reconstruction, so led to Jim
Yeah.
Crow, apartheid, and how many years until the Civil Rights Movement in the.
Southerners called it redemption.
Well, yes, it was called the redemption,
The
yes,
redemption, and so
as
they,
opposed to Reconstruction.
correct, and so they
Right,
could
it was
re-enslave the
redemption. Right,
blacks.
right,
Yeah.
it was redemption, right,
Yeah.
for the whites,
Well,
Yeah.
Of course.
right, and it was the birth too of the KKK.
That's why the South lost the war but won the peace.
They did for a while,
Well, still
right.
do. No, they still do.
yeah, well.
I mean, it
Slavery,
really
we
does.
no longer have slavery, that's for sure.
Well,
Yeah, good.
I mean, and yet we still have, and I mean, I think I keep coming back to this idea that if you look at all sort of these major turning points, so many times in our history, like the central driving force has been based on some sort of racial issue.
Right.
And that seems to continue and continue, and we never seem to be able to, and maybe it's because it's poisoned at the start, I don't know, but we never seem to be able to deal with that in a way that puts it to rest.
We call it the original sin. I mean,
Right.
that is really the original. I don't know how you. Well, I do think there's been progress made, frankly, but
Yeah.
it sticks with us. You're right.
Right. But I mean, as you pointed out, the Samuel Tilden, Rutherford Hayes, I mean, that ended up, that whole thing turned on race. The
Right,
founding,
that's
certainly,
right.
I mean, there were other issues perhaps, but I think a big part of adopting the Electoral College, the census, all of these things that were at our very core of how we go about choosing leaders in this country there was a racial compromise there.
Right.
And maybe that's it. Maybe there's some element of this. We continue to compromise something that really is uncompromisable, and so we never really deal with it. I don't know.
There was one time we didn't compromise. That was called the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
There was no
Yeah.
compromise about that. Lincoln made that clear.
I mean, that's true, but there were compromises around the 14th
right.
Amendment,
Right.
and should it
Right.
apply only to the governments, or should it apply to private actors as well?
Yeah, sure, right.
So I don't know. It's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, that's essentially the extent of my prepared comments, as disjointed as maybe they were. So I'm happy to sort of continue the conversation, either about the future. I mean, so if the other option, somebody brought up the National Popular Vote Compact, which, if constitutional, would be fairly simple. The other option, and the reason folks have pursued the Popular Vote Compact, the other option is to amend the Constitution, to eliminate the Electoral College and make it a popular vote. But that, as you probably recall, it requires a 2/3 vote in Congress, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it before it goes into effect. And we've only done that 27 times in 250 years.
It has
So
happened.
it has happened.
Right.
Certainly.
But why has not that happened? Why have people, mainly our leaders, both parties have hung on to the Electoral College? Why?
I read something, Sandy, about George W. When he was president, he came close to saying, yes, let's have a
Which one?
national popular vote.
Which one?
W.
W.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, because of Bush v.
Forgot
Maybe
off the
because of
bat.
Bush v. Gore. That was a very hotly contested
Yeah.
situation also. And maybe he had I don't know. I don't know why he would have, because of course he won through the Electoral College.
Well, that's what gives him the credibility to do it.
Maybe,
in
but he
some
didn't do
ways.
it.
He
But he
didn't do it.
didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think to my mind, I always feel like there's because you'd think, and there has been different efforts over the years, and they've sort of waxed and waned. I mean, after Bush v. Gore, there was outrage about the Electoral College. after 2016, that wasn't the narrative. Even though it was essentially the same thing that happened in terms of Bush v. Gore, with the popular vote going one way and the electoral vote going the other way. And so I always sort of fall back on, I kind of feel like that both parties are scareder of the
Yeah.
unknown. Like the known bad is better than the unknown possible good. There's a phrase that's something like that. I'm totally getting it wrong, but that phrase where like the unknown is worse. And so we know what happens the way it's set up now, even if we don't necessarily like it, and we don't
know what happens. We don't know what's going to happen within the next month.
Well, no,
We
I'm
have
saying the
no idea.
parties, they understand it. They understand it. And there's a fear of how does the power balance shift if we had a
Yeah.
popular vote?
Well, I think in the current situation right now, Republicans know that they would be defeated
Right.
regularly, and so they are, of course, adamant against any kind of amendment doing
Right.
away with the Electoral College.
The Democrats aren't going to amend it either. When they've
Well, you-
had the power, they haven't done it either.
Right. I guess you had Reagan and Bush won, but Bush won was the last time a Republican presidential candidate won the popular vote. And I don't remember what it was. That was the Ross Perot days, maybe, or I don't know. When did Bush win? He beat who? Michael Dukakis?
Which one?
When did
Yes,
Bush won?
yes, he beat
Who
Michael.
did he run against?
Michael Dukakis.
Yeah.
Who?
Michael
Who?
Dukakis.
Dukakis, yeah, right, that guy. But he lost based on race too.
Well, and so you've got either way, you've got to get, even if you get Congress to go for it, you've got to get 3/4 of the states.
Right,
So that's why I think you're seeing this. I mean, I would predict that I would be surprised if we don't at some point end up with 270 votes on that compact. We got 196. Then it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And if they were, again, sort of reading tea leaves, but if they're going to follow their dicta in Bush v. Gore, that states retain the authority to determine how they award their electors, then I think they'd have to say it's constitutional for them to do it based on the national popular vote. That would be the argument I'd make if I was the lawyer on behalf of states that want this. But that remains to be seen.
Any other questions or thoughts about this great institution? But you'll notice, with all the talks about institutional racism that are going on right now, including in our own city, there are very few discussions about the Electoral College because people do not understand it. They don't understand where it came from or how it operates. I mean, how many of us knew it, Did anybody know how it had happened in the first place? Or I think, I
I
know
feel like people generally have an idea, but I think
I don't
sometimes
think so.
how the different levers can be pulled and how that can muck the whole thing up. I mean, this is the first time we're seeing that in our lifetimes happening, where what the president's doing is legal, but very problematic from the perspective of history. And so I think this is our first sort of experience with what that can look like.
Well, we
Big
saw it in
thanks
Bush
to
v.
Trump.
Gore. We saw it in Bush v. Gore too, but nobody kind of figured it out because Gore conceded.
Right.
I mean, that's the
Right.
only reason we didn't see it play out totally is because he conceded.
So we can thank Trump for a history lesson and
Yeah,
or
yeah, thank you
something.
very much.
Yeah.
I have a
Uh,
question. I just wondered, Jared, could you go over the end run way that you could get at rather than having to make this change through the legislature and all of the states?
Yeah.
How could the individual states do the end run
Yeah.
to basically get rid of
So,
the electoral
Yeah, so the
college?
US Constitution says you've got to get a majority of the electoral votes to be the president. So
Right,
that's right now 270. You've got to get it. The states can't change that because the Constitution says that's what you've got to get. But the Constitution also says the states can decide how they award their electors. So if 270 electoral votes worth of states decide we're going to award our electors based on the national popular vote, then you'd still have the Electoral College, but it would essentially become meaningless because whoever won the national popular vote would get automatically those 270 votes required to win.
so
uh,
how many now
196.
I think it's
100
196. I think.
Okay.
No, I know, but I think Lou's question is how many states are linked to the popular
That was
vote?
at 17, I think.
He said, I thought Jared said 38 and
No,
that
no, no, not
17 are
38.
not.
38 was the in 38 states, the electors right now are legally obligated to
Yeah,
vote
that's-
consistent with the state
Yeah, that's what
popular
I said.
vote.
Yeah. So how
but
many
not
are
the
not?
national.
17, right?
12.
12.
I guess 12 are not. But that's
12.
different than the
Compact.
popular vote compact.
Did you say, Brett?
You could Google it. I don't know how many. Is it Tim? I think you
Yeah,
said
okay.
13. You said or 16.
I thought you said 17, which sounds right to me.
Oh boy.
Oh, boy.
No, wait a minute. Okay, so Jared, what Grant is saying, is this correct? That,
Go ahead.
yeah, okay, which is,
Okay, I can tell you exactly how many here in just a minute. How many have signed on to it? It doesn't say these states represent as of been done. 15 states and the District of Columbia have signed on. That totals 196 electoral votes. It's 73% of the 270 it would need to have legal, legal force.
wow.
Um,
So that's, okay. So it's still possible. I mean, I know in the Bush v. Gore case, for instance, the Florida legislature was going to make a decision before there was a thorough recount. They said, if
stopped
you
the
guys,
recount.
they stopped the recount. And so
Yeah.
basically they said, we have the power to stop the recount and go the way we want to go, right?
Yeah, yes, under the federal constitution,
Right.
they stopped the recount, but they still said, and I'm going to get the dicta wrong, but they essentially said that the state legislatures have the authority, and I could find the exact language, but they implied that state legislatures retain so much authority that they could actually change
Yeah,
the way that they're awarded midstream or after the popular vote.
right.
Which would obviously create all sorts of political havoc and therefore is unlikely, I think, to happen.
Right.
But the Supreme Court implied that it's at least possible.
And I think that's why eventually that Biden will be inaugurated, because I don't think that even the Supreme Court wants the total chaos that would
Yeah.
happen if all of a sudden Trump is selected by the Electoral College. I mean, can you imagine? It'd be civil war.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. I don't think there's any.
I don't think
way
so
that Trump's
either.
gonna be
But there were big hearings in
elected.
Nevada today. Did anybody watch it?
Were those official hearings?
Yeah, they were in the court. They were in a court, yes.
Okay, because Giuliani has been establishing these kind of circuses where there are supposed testimony taken, but it's all.
They were taking
outside the
testimony
legislature.
today. I watched them. They were taking testimony today in the Nevada court that was presided over by a judge.
Okay.
Okay, okay, so we have another couple weeks to, I guess,
Keep
hear
wringing
about
our
all this
hands
stuff and be hanging on our fingernails to see what happens,
So-
right?
So
Yeah.
Jared, what's your take on it? What do you think's going to happen?
Oh, I mean, my personal. So I back in 2016, maybe folks remember that the Donald came to Burlington and spoke at the Flynn.
Right.
And
Yeah,
my
I
dad
went.
and I,
I went.
you know, I had a bunch of hats. In fact, I probably still have some here. Hold on a minute. I had a bunch of these made up for a different purpose. This is Make Burlington Great Again. But my dad and I decided we were going to go try to get tickets to go to this
I
thing.
did too. I did too.
And they say you could sign up and get tickets.
But you have to.
And then, of course, none of the tickets really existed. It was classic Trump. None of the tickets really existed. There was only really like 100 tickets, and he gave out 20,000 or something. Anyway, as a result of that sort of humorous, let's go see what this is about. I'm on his mailing list, and so I get daily emails from Eric, Donald Jr., Ivanka, Laura. I mean, I'm like pals with them, and sometimes I reply to them, and they never email me back. I don't know why. They keep calling me friend. A friend. We have an important election fundraising deadline. I'm like, an election happened a month ago. What deadline are you possibly raising money for?
Electoral College is what they're
Well,
talking
so
about.
here's my theory on it. I think Trump knows he's done. He's not going to get no court has found any fraud. Bill Barr said there wasn't any widespread fraud yesterday or today. I think Trump is a lot of things. I don't think he's a complete idiot. I think he knows he's lost the election. He's not going to be the next president. I think what he's doing, and it's based on the fact that I get emails asking him for money, 7 of them a day from his entire family. He knows if he can continue to make it seem like there's something going on, and they've got all these lawsuits going, people will keep giving him money. And they've in fact raised $170 million since election day.
What a shame.
It's a gift.
And he can use that because it's a PAC. He can use that money on basically, I mean, he can pay for his plane rides around the country, meals, staff, whatever he really wants. So it's kind of a slush fund. I mean, these PACs are slush funds.
It's a
I
Donald
have a
Trump.
different theory. I have a different theory, which
Well,
is
great.
that he's going to announce his candidacy for 2024.
Oh yeah, no, but I'm saying I think you're
On
probably right.
Inauguration Day.
What?
I think you're probably right, but he'll
Right.
use this 170 million
Yes.
to go all
Yes.
around the country campaigning and doing
Yes.
whatever he's going to do for the
And
next
he's
4
holding
years.
his first rally in Georgia on Saturday.
Right,
Yeah.
but there was talk about him holding his declaration for 2024 on inauguration day.
No.
Yes. Hey, by the way, it's legal, you guys.
What's legal?
So don't get all in a
What he does.
furor about it.
I
It's
can
totally
get all in a snit about it being unethical, whether it's
No.
illegal or not.
unethical to announce that you're running for president. I could do it too. Is that unethical? What's unethical about it?
As the sitting president,
Uh,
I think.
No,
Hey, how
no, he
about
won't be.
taxes?
He'll do it on inauguration day.
How about tacky?
What?
yeah.
Tacky, yeah, tacky.
I
Well,
don't
this
know.
is very interesting. Thank
Thank
you,
you, Jared.
Jared.
Yeah, good to see
Yeah.
you. Thanks for all
Okay,
the great
so-
conversation and
And-
By the
questions.
way, this is our last session for this season, but we're beginning again in January. And we have already 2 scheduled events, which are not basically tied to the law so much, but one, Professor Andrew Buchanan, who's a historian at UBM, will be here to talk about China today, tomorrow, the world, I guess.
Yeah.
And then the second one that we've booked already is Jane Nodell, who will be here to talk about whether or not the United States can continue to print money and what that means. So we'll be announcing the sessions soon. Okay,
cool.
so thank
Okay.
you all for being here tonight,
Thank you.
Hey,
and hope
everybody
to
be
see you
well.
guys in person at
Thanks,
some
Opie.
point.
Good to see
Okay,
folks
bye.
on the holidays.
you.
Take
Care.
care.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
Do this.